Because spiritual abuse is something that it can feel really slippery. It can feel really hard to get our hands on and to get our hearts around.
It doesn't necessarily show up immediate. It can take time.
It's what therapists would call flooding. Now they can't think straight. They can't see straight. They don't know how to react.
Pastors can abuse their authority and people won't say a word because they think it was legit.
Define spiritual abuse. What is spiritual abuse to you? And I know you defined it in books. I've got definitions that I love, but just in conversation, as we say, hey, here's kind of what this term means to me, I think it helps to set the foundation for the conversation. So when you think about spiritual abuse in churches today and people going through spiritual abuse, what is it that you're thinking of, and kind of how do you define that in your spirit?
Yeah, it's a discipline that is in the process of development into clarity, and people are discussing this. But Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys in England. Lisa wrote her dissertation on this very topic, so she has a more analytical, long-winded, you could say, definition of spiritual abuse.
That's the definition we use, but it is very long.
It is long, yeah, and there's some really important points. But for me, it is when there is an asymmetrical relationship between someone with spiritual authority in a person's life over another person, that they use in a way that traumatizes. Now, this is a word that I haven't used in defining spiritual abuse before. Mm-hmm. That traumatizes the person under them in a way that is, in a sense, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually wounding. Mm. So there has to be an asymmetry of power. It has to be a spiritual relationship. And there has to be an act of something done that traumatizes a person. In general, we would say it is a repeated act rather than a single time. Someone might get angry one time, and that might not be spiritual abuse. It could be in a bit. But we're also, I think, looking for a bit of a pattern. Does this person generally do this with other people, or is this just a one-time person? I'm in consultation at times with let's say, denominational leaders in churches, and there is a case going on in my conversations about a pastor who seems to be, let's say, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, people just adore the guy. But every now and then, there's someone that he works with who's under him that that doesn't work out, and neither, let's just say, the pastor doesn't handle it well, and it becomes abusive to the people. So there is a sense in which abuse is perceptive. It's perceptional. In other words, most pastors who abuse other people spiritually do not intend to abuse them. Some of them do, but they don't. But they don't intend it. But the impact, we have to distinguish between intent and impact in abuse situations. The impact is abusive, those are the sorts of categories that I use in defining it. But trauma, I think trauma studies help this, because trauma studies discusses trauma as an incident, event, a relationship, a moment that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. That's what spiritual abuse is about. It overwhelms the person. And Jeff, there's another side to this that is important, I believe, and that is it doesn't necessarily show up immediately. It can take time. I was dealing with a young woman the other day. Well, she's not young. She's in her 40s, I think. She's young for me.
I appreciate you calling people in their 40s young. Makes me feel good.
She experienced something about 10 years ago that over time has festered into a consciousness that it was actually abusive, and it harmed her and wounded her for 10 years. And she's now, seeing a therapist and working things out. So that's sort of how I would define spiritual abuse.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard, because anytime somebody talks about, Lisa and Justin's definition, one of the things I think that almost everybody will say is, "Hey, it's long and it's detailed." Yet I find most of the time, when we ask that question, our answers become long and detailed because spiritual abuse is something that it can feel really slippery. It can feel really
Mhm.
hard to get our hands on and to get our hearts around and our minds around. And I appreciate you telling the story of the person who years later was realizing this was spiritual abuse. One of the things that we run into in a lot of our conversations with people in our community is they didn't realize they were in an abusive situation for years and years and years, and then finally did while still in the situation. But that awareness altogether, it's what therapists would call flooding. Now they can't think straight. They can't see straight. They don't know how to react.
Mhm.
And the smallest things almost begin to set them into a spiral. So when we
Mhm.
start unpacking this with people, I kind of give the illustration of having just this ball of tangled stuff in your gut, this slippery, slimy, tangled stuff in your gut. And what we got to do is we got to kind of unravel the threads of where this abuse started and unravel it over time. But I think that's important for audience members to hear and to know is um, it's okay if you didn't realize it was spiritual abuse in the first place, right?
Mhm.
It's okay if it takes you a little while to realize that. And I think sometimes, Scott, there's almost a guilt. If I didn't realize it was spiritual abuse in the first place, then is something wrong with me? Am I just trying to get back at people if I call it what it is later? Um, but I've also noticed that if we don't call it what it is, if we don't tell the truth about the story we've been through, it can really make it hard to heal. Why do you think, just as you kind of look at people's experiences like that, what are some things you see that you think cause that makes it so hard for us to recognize spiritual abuse? Not just the person who's gone through it. Sometimes it's hard for family members, but even when a person realizes I've been through spiritual abuse, we need to address this. A lot of times, other people in the congregation who they've loved and they've known and they've done life with have a hard time seeing it or believing it.
Mhm.
So what are some things you think of that make it so difficult for us to actually see and understand spiritual abuse as abusive practices?
This is really an important part of what's going on, and that is spiritual leaders have authority in our lives at some level, whether we recognize it or not. They have some authority, um, and they are trusted, and they are trusted even when they have to say hard things to people. Now, not everybody accepts hard things. Some people immediately fight back. Okay, and that might not be good either. But because they have spiritual authority and because leadership involves making difficult decisions about people, sometimes they have to make difficult decisions that is their proper authority. I was talking to a pastor the other day, and the pastor's made some decisions that other people in the church don't agree with very much.
And they had to make decisions, and it's their right to make those decisions, and it's okay. So that's one side of it. But I think the other side of it is that people in churches are naturally, incurably, probably for the good overall, trusting of pastors, and they believe what they say. The result of
Mm,
which, at times, pastors can abuse their authority, and people won't say a word because they think it was legit, because that pastor's got authority and that pastor's godly, and that person mediates God to me over and over. Um, so I think that's part of it.